Malcolm Hayes had always been easy to overlook. He wasn't loud like Brandon Hall or effortlessly charming like Tyler Whitman. He didn't go out of his way to draw attention, and over time people stopped noticing him altogether, especially Mrs. Kensington. She had spent the entire year calling on the same students, the ones she knew would give her the answers she wanted. But Malcolm? She acted as if he weren't even there. At first he told himself it didn't matter. But the more it happened, the more he saw it for what it was. Dismissal. A quiet, calculated disregard until today. "Malcolm," Mrs. Kensington said, her voice smooth, her smile unreadable. "Why don't you play something for us?" The classroom buzzed with low whispers. A few kids snickered, waiting for the punchline. Malcolm knew why she was doing this. She wasn't curious. She didn't care about his talent. She expected failure, wanted it even. But what she didn't know was that he had spent years learning from his grandfather, a jazz pianist who had played in clubs long before Malcolm was born. He walked to the old upright piano at the back of the room, feeling every stair digging into his back. He sat, flexed his fingers, and let them hover over the keys. Then he played. The first notes were soft, deliberate, curling through the air like smoke. The rhythm built, steady and hypnotic, his hands moving effortlessly between melody and harmony. Then he shifted, rolling into something more complex, a deep bluesy run his grandfather had taught him, something raw and alive. The room changed. The laughter stopped. The whispers faded. Students who had never given him a second thought leaned, in eyes wide. Brandon, who had been grinning moments ago, sat frozen. Even Tyler, who always had something to say, was silent. But the real moment of victory came when Malcolm glanced up at Mrs. Kensington. She was stiff, her arms crossed, her lips pressed together, and in her eyes, just for a second, there was something she couldn't hide: shock. She had underestimated him, and now in front of everyone she had no choice but to see him. Malcolm didn't need her approval. He had already won. Malcolm let the final note linger in the air, the rich sound filling the space where doubt had once lived. His fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment longer before he slowly rested his hands in his lap. The classroom remained still. No laughter, no whispers, just the weight of something unspoken settling over everyone. Then, a single clap. It came from the back of the room, hesitant at first. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire class erupted into applause. Even Tyler, usually too cool to be impressed, let out a low whistle. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've been holding out on us." Brandon sat with his arms crossed, still looking for something to say. But even he couldn't hide the begrudging respect in his expression. Across the room, Madison Green, who rarely paid attention to anything that wasn't about her, leaned forward, eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure Malcolm out. But the loudest silence of all came from Mrs. Kensington. She hadn't moved, hadn't joined in the applause. Her face was carefully composed, but Malcolm saw it. The stiffness in her posture, the way she gripped the edge of her desk a little too tightly. He had shaken something in her, something she hadn't expected. "Well," she said at last, her voice clipped, her mask slipping back into place. "That was unexpected." The applause faded, but the energy in the room didn't. Malcolm turned on the bench to face her fully. "You didn't think I could play, did you?" His voice was steady, calm. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. Mrs. Kensington's gaze sharpened. "I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class." Malcolm shook his head. "No, you didn't. You thought I'd mess up. That's why you asked." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Kensington's fingers curled slightly against her desk. "That's enough, Malcolm." But he wasn't done. "You wouldn't have asked Tyler, or Madison, or Brandon, but you asked me." The room held its breath. "You're out of line," she said, her voice tight. Malcolm met her eyes. "I don't think I am." For the first time all year, Mrs. Kensington wasn't in control, and this time Malcolm wasn't going to let her look away. For the first time, Mrs. Kensington looked unsettled. the quiet authority she always carried, the invisible barrier that kept students in their place. It was cracking. Malcolm could see it, and so could everyone else. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice sharp. Malcolm didn't move right away. He let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of it, the way the room was no longer hers to control. Then, without breaking eye contact, he stood and walked back to his seat. The sound of his footsteps felt louder than they should have, in the hushed room. As soon as he sat, the whispers started again. Not like before. Not taunting. This was different. It was the kind of murmuring that meant something had shifted. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Kinda weird. How you don't want to talk about it," he muttered. Mrs. Kensington's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Brandon shrugged. "You made a big deal about him playing, but now you're acting like it never happened." More students nodded. A few exchanged looks. Even Madison, who had spent most of the year caring about nothing but her own world, was watching with interest. Mrs. Kensington's jaw tightened. That's enough, but it wasn't. Not really. The rest of the class dragged on, but the usual rhythm was gone. Her voice didn't carry the same weight. The students weren't as engaged. It was like an invisible thread had been cut, and the control she'd once had wasn't as strong anymore. When the bell rang, chairs scraped against the floor as students packed up their things, still murmuring. Malcolm grabbed his bag and was heading for the door when Mrs. Kensington's voice stopped him. "Malcolm." He turned back. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, as if debating whether to say something meaningful, something real. Instead, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope you understand that this is still my classroom." Malcolm studied her for a long moment, then nodded, his voice calm. "I know." A beat of silence passed between them before he turned and walked out. In the hallway, Tyler caught up with him, grinning. "Bro, what was that? You just flipped everything upside down." Malcolm exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath. "Yeah," he said, a small smile forming. "I think I did."